Hello, wonderful. I am here with Sandra L. Brown, MA, who is the author of several amazing books I read recently, Women Who Love Psychopaths, as well as Avoiding Dangerous Men, which I finished today. How to Spot a Dangerous Man. How to Spot a Dangerous Man. And so many good goodies in there. And this idea of conscientiousness, doing the right thing, trying to do right by people, and having your kindness used against you, and how that plays out in toxic relationships. Hey, Sandra, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good. I love your glasses. I love red. Ever seen those people, like the red and purple people? Like they wear like the red, is it Red Hat Society or something?
Mm-hmm. Right.
They were like our red and purple. Like we look good together today. Well, Sandra, thank you for coming back and talking to us some more. I'm pulling out my notes again. But we just connected so much on this issue of conscientiousness and your kindness being used against you. So why don't you explain to them what conscientiousness means and how that plays out in toxic relationships?
So our last chat,
Yes.
we started talking about what we call the super traits, which is the research that we did with Purdue that helped us understand the types of personalities that are targeted. And I think it's what stands out as important to me, and that is that you can't guard something you're not aware of. And so there are personality types that toxic and pathological people are sort of more drawn to. And the last chat, we talked about the first personality trait that we became aware of, which was agreeableness. And there is another trait, which is the trait of conscientiousness. And so what that means is that on a bell curve, that both agreeableness and conscientiousness were a little over the bell curve of what we like to see sort of in the middle, which is sort of this safety net. And so having a little bit too much conscientiousness can actually be problematic, but only, the interesting thing about the research was that it was only problematic with pathological people, who are the ones who will take advantage of absolutely anything. And so having too much conscientiousness is not like, I want to say what it isn't. We're not talking about something like a personality disorder. It is a personality trait, but it is not into that whole category of being a personality disorder, but it's a little bit over the bell curve, so people need to be aware of that. So the importance about conscientiousness and how this ties into survivors' recovery is that this trait of conscientiousness is all about living. People who have high levels of conscientiousness live very much by principles and values and a strong belief system. In fact, they're even more gung-ho about those values, beliefs, and principles than people who have less conscientiousness. And so what that ends up, meaning is that these relationships cause them, of course, to violate every principle, every belief, every value that is important to them, because they are with someone who has no principles, values, etc.
Yeah.
So the more that they are in violation of them, their own sense of self and what's important to them, which are values and principles, the more damaging it is to their sense of self. And so we kind of touched on that last time when we talked about that this issue of having high amounts of conscientiousness means they are more prone to problems in their recovery with cognitive dissonance, and also with just having this wide kind of spread feeling of self-violation. And I think that's really where a lot of the recovery work actually ends up being focused on, because many of them talk about not being able for them to trust themselves.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of recap what she's saying, with like, think about this. Like, when you think about, do you want your daughter or son to be principled, live by their values, be authentic to a belief system? Oh my gosh, yes. And then these toxic people are coming in, conning them to violate every principle and every belief system and every value. And then when these women, so many of them, or men, when they try to go and get help, people saying, oh, you must have, you can't stand up for yourself. Right? You need better boundaries. You need better this. And it's like, God, the devastation and the lack of understanding on this issue is huge, huge, huge.
Right. And the problem is that other trait we talked about last week, that trait of agreeableness, where there's all that empathy and tolerance and trust, works in tandem with this issue about values and principles. And in the moment of all this gaslighting and conning, they're very relationship oriented. And so all that agreeableness of working harder, towards the relationship goal ends up taking precedence over this issue of conscientiousness. And so it's like that agreeableness, that trust, compassion, empathy, tolerance leaves. And that's what appears to be strongest, in the midst of the relationship. But it's actually the conscientiousness in violating that themselves in terms of working against their own value system that ends up causing the most cognitive dissonance and traumatic experience, when they don't recognize themselves. They don't recognize their core strengths anymore, because they've been guided more by that agreeableness than the conscientiousness. And so it should be sort of obvious that recovery has a lot to do with being guided by the conscientiousness, that in order to get back and the ability to recognize oneself and live by values that you say were important, etc., make your walk and talk match.
Yes.
Is to shift that, where you're not being led just by conscientiousness, that you are now stepping back into, you're not being led by agreeableness, you're stepping back into the conscientiousness, which settles the cognitive dissonance and helps survivors to be able to recognize themselves again and feel like they're not out of control, not living by their own, value and belief systems, which is very disarming to people who do tend to have conscientiousness. And I know, in treatment, we spend, once we get the trauma reduced, the next big issue is this whole issue about who am I?
Yeah.
How did that happen? I can't trust myself. I say I believe all of this, and then when push came to shove, I didn't. and that they have difficulty, a lot of their recovery is about trying to get back to that self-concept again.
Well, and I want to point out something you said, because you just like dropping like bombs everywhere right then. I was like, let's talk about that. I want to talk about that. Okay. In case anyone hasn't seen the other video, let's talk a bit about cognitive dissonance and how that plays out in toxic relationships. Because what I heard you say is we end up leading by agreeableness rather than conscientiousness. And one of the ways to heal that cognitive dissonance within ourselves is to latch back on to that conscientiousness. Okay. So explain a bit about cognitive dissonance and how conscientiousness helps overcome that.
So the number one hallmark feature that we found in our studies of survivors from narcissistic and psychopathic abuse is this symptom of cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is an internal conflict in which you're trying to hold simultaneous thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that are complete opposite. And so when you're in a relationship with somebody who has a Jekyll and Hyde personality, and you're in a relationship with essentially two very different people, you have to develop a skill set for each side, and that you end up having very different experiences with both sides of that person. And so cognitive dissonance is when you are unresolved in yourself, and that those experiences remain unprocessed, like I love him and loathe him, trust, distrust, want, don't want, crave, repulsed. And it's these dichotomies or dichotomous kinds of feelings and experiences because you've been essentially in a relationship with two different people. And so survivors find that cognitive dissonance is very much like ping-ponging.
Yes.
They talk about this internal movement of being like the swaying with I love, I want, because they're still processing both sides of a very different relationship, all the love bombing and yet, all of the abuse. So that's why it's a number one hallmark feature, because that's what, personality disordered, toxic kind of people do. They have two sides, and we end up as one person responding to those two sides and being a complete mess.
May I jump in there a bit? And so let's go through some examples in case someone's confused. So it's like, okay, he helps, he's very active in his church, and he's very angry at home. Like, is that cognitive dissonance that trying to those two beliefs?
Two different it could be two different sets of behaviors. So he quotes scripture and he violates scripture.
Perfect. Yep.
Right. He's an elder and he's a porn addict.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's so
enlightened yogi, get out of a different belief system and like get an enlightened yogi or someone, or the women who, it's really interesting working with women who have been with male psychologists who are pathological.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, so sorry.
Or clergy, or
yeah, they help other people, and they talk circles around me.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's cognitive dissonance. So conscientiousness.
Yeah.
I am still a good person and I'm divorced. Would that be a good example of that?
Yeah. Well, so what we hear a lot is I'm against violence. He's violent and I'm still here. I'm against drug dealing. He has, dealt drugs and we're still in a relationship. And so that dissonance which is so disorienting. And on top of it, it's paralyzing, like in a
Oh
decision
yeah.
making,
Oh,
situation, is that dissonance happens on 3 levels. So it happens, you have dissonance about him. He's a good dad, but he's horrible to me. He's a Christian, but he's a porn addict. Then there's a level of dissonance about the relationship itself. I want it, I don't want it. And then the worst dissonance is a byproduct of the other two, is the dissonance about self. I'm a strong person, but I can't leave. I'm paralyzed in the decision making. And so, dissonance, imagine, I wish I could create like a 3D mobile.
uh-huh.
If you had 3 of these swirling arms of 3 different types of cognitive dissonance going on at one time: him, the relationship, and yourself.
So
And
relationship and self. I'm always taking notes with Sandra, because she throws out such good stuff, and I want to like capture it and then go back to it. So yeah, him, like cognitive dissonance regarding who he is.
him, about the relationship, and about oneself. And so just when, one of them dies down, then something kicks up, one of the other ones, and it keeps going and going. And then, it becomes a very paralyzing thing when your brain isn't working from all of this dissonance. And it's critical for you to be making decisions, about leaving or whatever decisions that needs to be made. So what the interesting thing about dissonance is that one of the reasons it is the hallmark feature is first of all, that people who have more conscientiousness are more prone to developing dissonance. And once they've developed it, it has, a pretty significant neuro impact
Yes.
to the brain, very similar to trauma, which makes decision making, organization, memory, concentration, all the kind of skill sets of executive functioning that you need in order to leave, really impaired.
And is that when women who don't know what's happening, what they are describing, are they using words like ruminating or overthinking?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what's happening within that. Yeah.
Yes. So it does, on the surface, and I think that's probably the experience that some of the survivors have had when they went to therapists who might not have understood pathological relationships, that on the surface that the survivor symptom looks like rumination. And it is a form of that, but I think it's a much more intense form, especially knowing that it's happening, on 3 levels with 2 different sides of a person. So if we think about, any breakup, like with a normal person, it's always painful, and you always replay he said, I said kind of stuff, which would be ruminating. But most people breaking up don't have to replay 2 sides of one person and then have dissonance on 3 different levels. This is why this stuff is so crippling, cognitively and emotionally to these survivors, because it's they're more prone to it from having conscientiousness, that and then the longer that they can't align their walk and talk and get back on the same page with that, the higher and higher the dissonance goes.
So when I was on my own healing journey, one of the things I had to start with is writing about my life. I would write letters to myself as if I were my best friend, trying to break through that cognitive dissonance, because I could not defend myself at that time. It was just very, I was just bare bones, right? I was just surviving. And I could not figure out a way to defend myself. But I thought, if this was happening to my friend, I could defend her. And I know in my own life, I feel like that's one of the first ways I kind of broke through that cognitive dissonance of like, okay, this is really happening and it's really happening to me. And if it was happening to someone else, how would I feel about it? Because I couldn't even attach what was happening to me. I was so numb.
Right.
So
Right.
whatever. But as soon as I was writing letters to her, it really broke forth and allowed me, I think, to tap into my own integrity, walking the walk. Okay. Is this, if it's not okay for her to experience this,
Right.
maybe I can start to grasp that it's not okay for me to experience this.
Right.
What are some other exercises that you've seen or components that you've seen to kind of help people put on the clothes of conscientiousness and kind of break out of the prison of cognitive dissonance? Yeah.
Well, two things. One thing that they can do as a reminder. Part of what happens from the trauma and the cognitive dissonance is that it wears out your brain. You can't sort, and your executive functioning part of the brain gets worn out. It's just too much. And so, I've often had clients say, can you remind me of the things that he's done and why I'm leaving? So she just listed all of them last week, and by this week there's been 100 more.
Yeah.
And she can't grab them. I mean, that is a snapshot of the neuro problems, with this. And and then what does that feel like? To be knowing that you're in the have been harmed in the worst possible relationship, and you can't even pull and recall those events that have happened. So for them to make lists,
Yes,
not journaling, which can be very triggering, traumatic, lists. And for people who really want to look at the crazy making and like why they feel crazy, I tell them to make kind of the dichotomy list. So I loathe, he's an elder, he's a porn addict, whatever those dichotomous and opposite. Actually, I have a list of these.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Trying to merge the both and conversations in your head, rather than either or.
Yeah.
Right.
So that, and I tell clients that all the time, that it's and that, with normal people, it might be or, but with this type of disorder, it's and you're experiencing both. You do love and loathe and want and don't want. And of course, I can't find it.
Well, and from your studies and from what I've seen, it's what I've read. It's really difficult to accept that the good version could be an act, right? It's that mask that's fallen off. They're using that to manipulate. They're using it as image management. They're using it as a responsibility avoidance, right? That's hard. It's hard to accept.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, what dissonance is, sort of the ping-ponging back and forth between being on the same page with that. I see it, I get it, and in 5 minutes, I'm not on that page anymore. And that to understand that is part of the trauma, that's part of the dissonance, it's part of the process, it's what you're trying to heal from. It's not going to stop tomorrow. This is why it is difficult, why dissonance is difficult. So to the degree that they're having a hard time remembering the betrayals and that kind of stuff, is that they could make a list. And if they want to make two lists in the feeling states or behavior states of dissonance, what he's doing or her feelings, loving, loathing, wanting, not wanting. That's also a good snapshot of why it feels so crazy inside. The other thing is, when you were asking about, the things about dissonance is, I think I mentioned this last time, is that dissonance is, a very widely researched social psychology theory with almost zero written about how to reduce it. They haven't spent near enough time in doing that. But what we do know about this issue of conscientiousness, and that these survivors have high levels of conscientiousness, is that dissonance is caused in part from having higher than normal levels of conscientiousness, and it's elevated even further every time they violate when their walk and talk don't match up. If you want to reduce dissonance, you have to lead with the core value and belief systems. So yes, I know the agreeableness is going to make you want to give them another chance and trust again, and maybe it's you. You can choose that, but you're going to jack up your cognitive dissonance. But anytime that you choose conscientiousness and lead with the behavior associated with the core values, the consistency of doing that helps to reduce dissonance. So if you have a choice between contact and no contact, and you know what your conscientiousness is telling you to do, even though it's painful, when you go with the no contact, for instance, in that case, it's going to begin over time to reduce that dissonance.
So the way I explain that to people, and tell me your thoughts on this, is if there was someone in the bed with a food addiction, they weigh 800 pounds, somebody has to be bringing them the food, right? So someone's bringing them the fried chicken, someone's bringing them the milkshakes. And if you said, if your conscientiousness says a good girl takes care of her family members, okay? So she could say, oh, I have to be a good girl and take him what he wants to eat. Or you could reframe it and say, well, a good girl doesn't help feed someone else's addiction, right? So if the person, even if they yell and say, I want the milkshake, right? It's not nice to take a cocaine addict cocaine. It's not nice to help someone become more selfish. It's not nice to help them avoid responsibility. It's not nice to, and that's a way I've had to do it in my own life and with my clients, because we want to be a nice girl. We want to be good. We want to be a good family member. And it's like, well, do you think it's good to help angry people give vent to their anger? Is that nice to you? Is that being a good person? They're like, oh, yeah, you're right. That's not being supportive. That's not being loyal. You start to see that crack through within peace.
Right. Yeah. So again, what has happened is they have been led by that trait of agreeableness. It hasn't stayed balanced with their other trait of conscientiousness. That's what the agreeableness is, always making the decisions. It's the part that can be guilted and motivated, by things that actually violate their conscientiousness and their values and principles. And so they have to make a conscious choice in conscientiousness to shift the way they're operating out of. And we talked about this last time, is that this is why this is the bigger piece of treatment, is them having to come to understand their own personality and how it's wired, because this has been what's been targeted in them, and it's always going to be targeted if there's pathological people around them, and they're, you know, they don't have to be in a relationship with someone to be targeted by it. So they do have to become really aware of how these super traits sound in their head. When they're not chaperoned, when they're not paying attention to the choices they're making from agreeableness, instead of making them more out of conscientiousness, what those super traits make them think, feel, do, how they react. Because reading about super traits in this book isn't the totality of the prevention that has to happen, because you take your personality with you. You always have your personality. And unfortunately, those are the traits that pathological people are going to be looking for, and that survivors have to learn how to make some changes that feel really unnatural in the beginning parts, especially because they are so led by agreeableness and by, trust and optimism about human behavior and tolerance. And
You
that,
talked in How to Spot a Dangerous Man. You said that women who have been taught to be polite, right?
Mhm.
And how politeness, and Becker talks about this in The Gift of Fear, right? It's like this man's coming up to you and he's a complete stranger, and you feel like you need to be polite and talk to
right,
him. And it's like he could be a rapist, and you're more worried. And you said this. You're more worried about being polite than being raped. Like that's the bell curve. For those of you who are listening, when the bell curve,
yes,
she's a little bit too much.
too much, right.
That's a little bit too much.
Right. And so because personality is innate, we come into the world with whatever our personality is, and we don't sit around thinking about it unless maybe we have a lot of shyness or something that's really uncomfortable. And so most of these women, maybe after they were, pretty far into a pathological relationship, they might have figured out, you know what, I have too much empathy, or I have too much. But for the most part, most of us don't really sit around thinking about our personality and then how to chaperone that to stop allowing the personality to just flow and do what it normally does. And that takes a lot of conscious awareness of the problem of that part of the personality. And so, that this really is the part of prevention, and working with the at-risk parts, of their personality. We talked about this last time. These are beautiful traits. It's what makes these wonderful, warm, loving people. And these traits in the hands of normal people are never problematic. It's what makes them wonderful partners. But, from the research with Purdue, it's exactly these traits that are problematic only in the hands of pathological people. And, that very much has to be, an awareness moving forward, because they're always going to have these traits. It won't always be problematic with everyone, but it
And there's
only
always
takes.
going to be toxic people, right? And I hear women, they say, I just wish all the nice people would find each other. And it's like,
Right.
okay. And Gary Thomas, I think his name is, he wrote the book When to Walk Away. And it's about toxic relationships. He wrote a marriage covenant book that then all these women came up to him and said, oh, I'm honoring my marriage covenant. And he was hearing these horrible stories. So I deeply respect that he went back and did a reframe on that, as so few people do, as you know,
Right.
Right?
Right.
And he called it maturity.
Mm-hmm.
He said, in my lower stages of as a child, I can assume, everyone's good, or everyone's, good people, bad people. It's easy to see the difference. And framing it as becoming mature means being the wisdom to know the difference. Being mature is knowing that if agreeableness is always making the decision, you're always going to keep ending up in the same place, which is not a safe
Right.
place. And
Right.
I love that idea of maturity, because it's like for people who are conscientious, right? That's a good goal. I want to be emotionally mature.
Right.
And emotional maturity means not arguing that there are, in my, I'm working on my book right now, and it said 2 truths. 1, there are toxic people. 2, you know them, right? It's like, that's the most basic, when we get into this argument of like, but I don't want there to be toxic people.
Right. Well, welcome, to the real world. 1 in 5 people have a personality disorder, and 1 in 100 have psychopathy. So they're everywhere, and you're who they want. And so, if you had diabetes, and you would learn how to protect yourself because you have diabetes. Well, you have this thing that's associated with personality, which luckily, usually when you have diabetes, you always have diabetes, but with your super traits, they're only problematic with, toxic kind of people. But you have to know that and guard that. And you can't guard something that you're not aware of. You can't eat better, if you don't know you have, diabetes, and that you need to be exercising and doing whatever. And so you do hear that a lot from survivors, that because of that trait of agreeableness, it's a very kumbaya trait, we want the world to be a good place, and we are very optimistic about human behavior in all of that. And it's not uncommon to have pushback in the beginning when you first begin to talk about these super traits. And I've had clients say, well, I don't want to walk around in awareness. Okay, don't.
Yeah, your choice. But I
Right.
love to hear her saying 4 out of 5 love these traits in a healthy way. 1 out of 5 use these traits against you in an unhealthy way. You still have decent odds, right, in finding healthy relationships, in surrounding yourself with healthy people. This is not it feels doom and gloom. I know from your work, people are like, don't you get tired of talking about horrible things all the time? I was like, what's everyone else talking about? The news? I don't know what they're talking about, And but within this conversation, 4 out of 5 people, these are safe traits with. Don't let the one person, Bill Eddy, he wrote the 5 types of people who will ruin your life. The way you described it is their changes they make can be measured in millimeters, and the damage they make can be measured in miles.
Right.
Yeah. Your odds are still somewhat decent. I don't want you to feel like you lose all hope. But if you aren't aware, you said this, right? You cannot keep yourself safe from what you cannot see.
Right. Or know or expect. I think that goes back to what you were talking about with maturity.
Yeah.
We're adults, we know that everything in life isn't kumbaya. There are all sorts of risks in life, not just this one, but all sorts of ones. But if it's your issue, if this is something like, if you had diabetes and it's something you have to pay attention to, then pay attention to it. It's your only hope, of being able to keep that toxic stuff away and not get re-traumatized and find the love you're looking for with healthy people.
A phrase that I hear a lot that I'd love to discuss with you is, how do I stop attracting toxic people?
You're not going to. And I hate every time I read this crap, 3 things to do to never attract. Well, what did you do with your personality? Did you have a lobotomy and throw it away? The research already shows that this group of personality disorders and psychopathy target their predatorial. They target people that have certain traits, which happens to be these traits. So they're not going to stop the attraction. So
You just got to stop opening the door.
yeah,
Right?
well, it's on us,
Right.
in order to know when we are around toxic people. We're the ones that have to be on guard, and be able to remove ourselves or recognize or whatever, because it's not just intimate relationships.
Absolutely.
Neighbors, it's bosses, it's family members, that kind of thing. So, unless you want to, put a whole shield around yourself and never go out.
Which I don't recommend. Baby, I don't know how you feel about that. I hate to see that, and that's really when I created my Wondrous Woman program, is because I had a friend who did exactly that, right? And so I saw her life and it stalled. Like she got out of this.
Yes, absolutely.
My life was like over here. And I was like, we basically had the same relationship. In fact, my cognitive dissonance was broken through when I heard her describe her relationship. And I went, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I've been experiencing, so I had such admiration for her to kind of help me in my own journey. And then I was so sad to see her stop. And her kids looked at her in the face and said, Mom, I thought when you got out, you were going to be happy, but all you're doing is hiding. And I was like,
right.
Oh, my kids are never going to say that to me, right? I was bound and determined to be aware and to be able to spot it, set those boundaries as much as I could.
Right. And the reason that people do that is because they don't feel confident in their ability to recognize it, remove themselves, keep themselves safe, whatever it is. And so that just tells me they haven't gotten what they need in order to get, back out there. We don't want them to read one book and get back out there. There's a lot more, work involved in that. But
3 books or 5. Like, I want to be super clear. Books are amazing. They are not, if there's no one who can call you on your cognitive dissonance, then you're missing a piece of the puzzle. Would you agree with that, in whatever form?
Yeah, well, I mean, 75% of these survivors have, significant trauma. So, if they haven't worked on, a recovery program for this, they're not going to be ready. They're going to be at risk because of trauma. On top of the super trait, they have to pay attention to the super traits, but if they've still got activated trauma, that's an issue too. So there's some work that has to go into, this recovery in order, to be able to get back out there. And sometimes, I always tell my clients, stay out 2 years.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, at least 2 years, and depending on their level of trauma, and work on you and this issue with super traits, and if there's trauma, whatever. But and the last time we talked, and I thought about this after we hung up in the last chat, you were talking about some of the I forget even what I called it because I don't have the book here. In the Dangerous Man book.
I've still got my notes. I can pull them up. Don't you worry.
Emotional something strategies. I guess I should read. I should read my own book.
No, it's okay. Emotional defense strategies.
Yeah, those. Okay. So if I was rewriting that today.
Yeah.
So that book was in 2005, and this one came out in 2018. So if I was rewriting that about those emotional defense strategies, instead of memorizing, these lists of traits and 8 dangerous man types, or what is narcissism traits, what is psychopathy traits, I would tell people.
Please listen to her right now. Like, I just want you to zero in, because this is what we see you all doing. Is trying to memorize traits of toxic people or asking for lists of red flags as if that was safe. So I just want to whoa, I get the glow around her head right now. I can say this. So keep going.
Yeah. So I would tell people not to worry so much about those. Go ahead, read a book, whatever sticks, that's great. But instead of, having a little cheat sheet or in your phone, okay, let's see, is he grandiose, or is he, this has to become very body-based. The one red flag that has never been wrong and that you spend all of your time trying to recover from is cognitive dissonance. If there was one thing to pay attention to, there was one red flag. It is when you are with someone and you begin to experience dissonance. That's what we've spent our whole time developing a treatment program, was for all the dissonance that was ignored. So I've always said, today's ignored red flag is tomorrow's cognitive dissonance, but the red flag is dissonance.
So I call it abstract thinking in my own work, which is like, what's happening? Why did that happen? Why you start questioning yourself and kind of like an abstract painting, and you try to, well, what is that, right? So you start to question and try to figure out, question yourself, question what happened, question the situation. And I love that she said, I want to point out, she said, the one red flag that none of you want to pay attention. I'm sending all the love, and none of you want to pay attention to, and I didn't pay attention to, right? But that is consistently true. One of the phrases that I work on with my ladies and pay attention to myself is, that's weird, right? That's weird. But okay, and when people say, I've become pretty good at predicting future toxic people behavior. And, to the point, there's a family friend, and I heard a story about how great her boyfriend was. My spidey sense went up, right? That's weird. Something, cognitive dissonance, something felt off. I went and talked to her father and said she needs to get out of that relationship. He's toxic. And, oh, Sarah, you're over exaggerating. You're bringing your past into this. Of course they ignored me. 6 months later, I run into her. I said, are you still with that guy? She said, I had to call the police. He stalked me. And I picked it up from a 2-minute conversation of my body sense, exactly what you're talking about. I've done the work. I do everything I can to listen to myself, to pay attention. I have a lot of these conversations too, so I can pick up things, as I'm sure Sandra can. And people kept saying, well, what did you pick up on? Well, I didn't know. My father did not say, oh, she's dating a stalker and she's eventually going to have to call the police because he's going to hit her. That is not the conversation that happened. He said how wonderful he was, how involved in church he was, what a great football player he was. These are all the things he told me. What my body picked up on, I don't know. I just know I have to trust it again.
Well, because dissonance, has been the number one hallmark feature in these relationships. If you don't have dissonance, you might have been in a bad breakup or whatever, but it probably wasn't a pathological relationship. Because this is the one thing that you can take it to the bank. Well, if that's the one thing, let the main thing be the main thing.
Agree.
So instead of memorizing these lists, what you need to be really aware of is how dissonance felt. In the early phases, how did it feel in your thinking, in your emotions, in the inner relating, maybe spiritually, maybe physically, somatically, in your stomach, hold tension in your jaw, maybe sexually. How I'm sure you experience dissonance on multiple levels. And what a survivor really needs to do is sort of replay once they get some insight into what dissonance was, and allow that to become an imprint.
I agree.
And maybe it's emotional, psychological, physical, whatever every kind of imprint that you can have. And you know, growing up, my father had, I don't know if I would say he was 100% narcissistic, but he definitely had narcissistic traits. And so, you know, I came into this field already knowing what all that felt like. And I've always said that, you know, if we can make, you know, an imprint of either the dissonance or what even somatically what we feel like in the presence of that kind of disorder, that becomes what I call templating, using that as a template from which to lay other kinds of experiences, you know, with newer people. And so, you know, I always said that I might not have known, you know, how to, as a child, how to describe, you know, narcissism, but I never forgot the way it made me feel. And I, even as a child, I use that as a template. And when other people, adults, and even, you know, in my, you know, early adult years, that I kept that as a template from which to compare other people. And we can do the same thing, you know, in cognitive dissonance, and it can be our primary red flag, where we don't have to go around with this Dead Sea Scrolls list of symptoms. But
we can't be talked out of it. When you have that Dead Sea Scroll list, and then because here's what people think,
right.
Oh, I'll go talk to him about this.
Right.
And then talk you out of it. And the cognitive I mean, you're on
right.
this side.
Maybe I took that wrong. Maybe I, right.
Out of it. Yes, yes. And what we feel like in the presence of that disorder. Like, I want you to hear what we feel like in the presence of that disorder.
Yes.
Using that as a template. Because in that situation, people said, what did you pick up on? I said, I didn't have all the data. I just had the experience and the experience in my body. And it was pretty bold to go talk to her father off that conversation, you know.
And not all survivors may have those somatic abilities. So we're all wired a little bit different. I'm very somatic, and I relied on that even, you know, working in the personality disorder to clinic in order to diagnose, because I could feel different personalities in different parts of my body, and I relied on that. That became more important to me than the DSM. But not all survivors have maybe that somatic sensing of that, but they've all experienced cognitive dissonance, even if it wasn't somatically, in other ways, emotionally and psychologically and spiritually. And so that there is still information from which to fall back on.
Can you describe what cognitive dissonance may feel like in that situation? I gave a couple examples, but in your own experience, what you've seen from other people, it's like, okay, I think what you and I were talking about is almost like a sixth sense, right? But if somebody, because we are wired differently, and if I don't want you to feel like, oh, I don't have that sixth sense, I don't have any way to protect myself, right? So I use that's weird, feels like something's off.
Yes.
Pay attention to how many, like, I'll notice my face like changes in like a way. What are some other things that you've?
Well, I think what's more important is that when a survivor you know, is in starting to work a recovery, is that they spend some time about going back to the experience, replaying the video of what they felt like, let's say the first time they met, or the first 6 months, or the first year, or in the next phase of the relationship, when the mask slipped, you know, or in the late phase, that there are different experiences, feelings, thoughts, intuitions, those kinds of things that they can capitalize on, which might be personal to them, what they experienced then. That is rich data. That is, you know, there could be a big part of their protection in the future if they will mine that information, to really be able to understand what it felt like. So you used the word, that's weird.
Yeah.
Anytime, yeah, what was the first red flag that you had? And you can break that red flag down by, it was something he said, or maybe it wasn't something he said, it was his body language, what you interpreted, what that made you think about, feel about. Did you experience it somewhere in your body? Did it come up in your dream life? Was it a spiritual issue? There's so much data that is there for survivors to be able to use as the red flag system the next time, because
I'm constantly amazed at how many women will spend, and I'm sure I did the same thing. I don't ever want to make it seem like, oh, I'm this, and these other women are like, I don't want to be that way. But it's like, oh man, if it's like, what are the red flags? They will pour over those lists and pour over this list and pour over those lists. And it's like, okay, let's talk about trusting yourself. And it's like, give me a red flag list, right? And I want to recognize the resistance to this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
And so, and that's a really tricky thing, because part of that cognitive dissonance about oneself is that until they work with that, they don't trust themselves.
Right.
So what I would say is, I'm not asking you to trust yourself per se, your judgment about to date or not date. I'm asking you to remember the messages that you got in the past that today, in retrospect, are clues. So if you spend some time mining that information, what are some of the things you noticed about what happened to your thinking, about your emotions, some of the behaviors that cognitive dissonance drove you to. Surveillance behaviors is one thing, breaking into his phone, his car, his computer, all of that kind of stuff. And so you don't need a list. What you need is, when you're thinking, feeling, relating, behaving, spirituality begins to go back into into a relapse kind of thing, into what you experienced before when you were with a pathological person. There you have it.
So maybe if the first step isn't trusting yourself, the first step can be remembering yourself.
Just remembering that there's information in there that you didn't know what you know now in order to know what that meant, but you know now, so go know again. So I really have, our clients really dig into that into that information, because it's cognitive dissonance is what normal people experience when they're around pathology. And so, end of story to me. That's the best thing. And if you don't want to, remember all these lists, and each, pathological person can be sort of different, or they can be a combination of a couple things. It is much easier, much more body-based to become conscious, come back into your body and be aware of when you begin to experience dissonance with someone, with your boss, with a neighbor. And it's a red flag to pay attention to. Something is going on that is a template to the experience that I had before with pathology.
I love that template language. There was a Sherlock Holmes, Netflix has this Sherlock Holmes thing, and he talked about his subconscious, and he would have all these scenes. He would like go into his, they called it mind palace, I think, and he would go into his mind palace to figure out all the clues to figure out. It was the way it was portrayed in this. But there was a scene from there, and he said something along the lines of, I always think my subconscious is smarter than I am.
Oh, absolutely.
And I love
no
that.
doubt.
I love that. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, and that's true. The subconscious is, or the whole mind is like an iceberg. They talk about that.
Yeah.
Only 10%, sticks up over the water. Only 10% of our mind is conscious. And so, so much of it isn't. And and I believe, a lot of times that our bodies are, are a lot smarter than our mind. Our minds have been through childhood and been trashed by, so many things. Anytime that I can take a different avenue than listening to this, if there's another option, I'm usually, trying to go for that option, like body sensing or whatever.
Especially if you know yourself. Like some of this is the maturity, the wisdom to know yourself, to know your personality. If you already know how likely you are to talk yourself out of doing right for yourself,
then don't listen.
Yes.
Yeah. Go another route. But and that's, part of knowing about the super traits, because super traits do talk you out of all sorts of things. That trait of agreeableness. But knowing enough about what your previous experience with pathology was through cognitive dissonance, and that becomes really your roadmap or your template for, this feels really familiar. Been here, done that. I don't have all the answers, and you don't need the answers. That's a loop.
You don't need all the answers. I mean, that's just, if you have all the answers, you have given them too many years.
Yeah. Nope. And survivors, and this is part of the super traits, wanting to have all the information so they can. So sometimes I think that's super traits, and sometimes I call BS. That, it's part of the loophole to, that they're not ready to, get out yet. But wisdom is, we don't need all that information. Like you said, then you're in too long. If you have if you have all those answers, you probably already have trauma by then.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Well, Sandra, thank you so much. I just love talking to you so much. Such fun.
Yeah, it was fun.
You're so wise. You're so wise. Any sign off comments on conscientiousness for our ladies?
Be conscientious about conscientiousness. Be conscientious. If you use your conscientiousness in your own recovery. Yeah. These are beautiful traits. These are your super traits are your superpowers when they are turned towards yourself. These are good things. You need every one of these in your recovery, and conscientiousness can absolutely be foremost of what you need in a strong recovery. So point it this way.
And great qualities in a healthy relationship.
Yep, they're great qualities. These people make wonderful mates when they get with normal people.
Normal people. More normal people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had fun. Thanks for having me.